Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. It's time for another section of Sexing the Cherry. I hope you enjoy this new book so far. It must have been in about 1640, when Jordan was something close to 10, that he met John Tradescant on the banks of the boiling Thames. It was a summer so hot that a housewife never had to lay a fire for her roasted pig. All she need do was tether it in the yard for an hour. For myself, the wafts of heat regularly assaulting me seemed to come from the very doors of hell, and I am sure that on Judgment Day those who are not on the side of the angels will feel this same scorching on their faces and toes, as a foretaste of their torments to come. I could scarcely step outside without sweating off enough liquid to fill a bucket. These waterfalls took with them countless lice and other timid creatures, and being forced to put myself often under the pump, I can truly say I was clean. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," said a Puritan passing by. "God looks on the heart, not a poor woman's dress," I retorted, but there was no stopping his little sermon, which he gave with his eyes rolled back as piously as a rabbit's. It is true that the ferment in the city is due not only to the heat, but also to the king seeming to turn Papish on us, and Parliament being in uproar, and Cromwell with his lump-shaped head stirring it and stirring it. Jordan had got up early one morning to sail his boats, and I had promised him an apple after my duties with the dogs. Squinting against the light, I set off to find him, and saw him in the distance sitting on an eaten-up jetty, a gentleman beside him. I hurried myself, thinking it might be some smooth-faced rascal set to chivvy him away. As I got closer, Jordan waved to me, and the gentleman stood up and bowed slightly, which pleased me a great deal, and said his name was John Tradescant. Then he gave a little pause, and said, "Gardener to the king." He was a good-looking man in his 30s, and he gave no sign of fear that the wormy jetty might dissolve at any moment, with my weight swaying it as a crow would a wren's house. He asked if I cared to sit down, and I took pity on him and trod back onto the bank. He squatted a while to fiddle in his bag and came out with 3 peaches. One he offered me, and one he gave to Jordan, who held it in both hands as though it were a crystal ball. "I grew them," said Tradescant. "You are eating from the king's tree." And then he bit into his and spurted the juice right over himself. Cautiously I bit into mine, but in a more ladylike fashion. Jordan did nothing, and I had to remind him of his manners. Tradescant told me he had been walking the length of the river from Putney to Mermaid Dock, troubling himself with a problem. He had seen a little boat sail by and was so enchanted by its easy passage that he forgot his melancholy and relived in his mind his own days of adventure on the seas. For years, until 1637 when his father died, he had sailed to exotic places, collecting such rare plants as mortals had ever seen. These he housed in his father's museum and physic garden at Lambeth. On his father's death he was forced to return from voyaging in Virginia and take up the family post of gardener to the king. He liked it well enough, but sometimes he felt hollow inside, and on those days he knew his heart was at sea. "A man must have responsibilities," he said, "but they are not always the ones he would choose." "Indeed not," said I, "and for a woman the devil's burden is twice the load." As Tradescant had stood on the bank watching the boat, his body like stone, his mind racing, Jordan had come running by, shouting encouragement to his little ship. His eyes were for his business, not on Tradescant's thighs, and in a moment the two of them were flat down on the bank, and Jordan was torn between the terror of being walloped and the possibility of losing his boat. As it was, Tradescant hauled him up, rescued the vessel, and took the two of them to sit down on the jetty, where I found them. He showed Jordan how to lengthen the rudder so that the boat could sail in deeper water without capsizing. He told him stories of rocks sprung out of the ocean, and only land as far as the eye could see, and no life on that land but screaming birds. He said that the sea is so vast no one will ever finish sailing it, that every mapped-out journey contains another journey hidden in its lines. I pooh-poohed this, for the earth is surely a manageable place made of blood and stone and entirely flat. I believe I could walk from one side to the other, had I the inclination. And if a great body of us had the inclination, there would be no part of the earth left untouched. What, then, if journeys folded in on themselves like a concertina? But Jordan believed him, and when Tradescant left, Jordan and I went home, he skipping ahead and carrying his ship, and I a few steps behind. I watched his thin body and black hair, and wondered how long it would be before he made his ships too big to carry, and then one of them would carry him and leave me behind forever. How hideous am I? My nose is flat, my eyebrows are heavy. I have only a few teeth, and those are a poor show, being black and broken. I had smallpox when I was a girl, and the caves in my face are home enough for fleas. But I have fine blue eyes that see in the dark. As for my size, I know only that before Jordan was found, a traveling circus came through Cheapside, and in that circus was an elephant. We were all pleased to see the elephant, a huge beast with a wandering nose. Its trick was to sit itself in a seat like any well-bred gentleman, and wear an eyeglass. There was a seat on its opposite side, and a guessing game was to offer up a certain number of persons to climb on the other seat, topsy-turvy, as best as they could, and outweigh Samson, as the elephant was named. No one had succeeded, though the prize was a vat of ale. One night, pushing along with a ribbon in my hair, I thought to try and outweigh Samson myself. I had taken a look at him, and he seemed none too big for me. So I got hold of the man who was bawling and jeering at the crowd to pit themselves against a mere beast, and said I would take the seat. "But, madam," screeched the little bit of vermin, "I see you weigh no more than an angel." "You know nothing of the Scriptures," said I, "for nowhere in the Holy Book is there anything to be said about the weight of an angel." His eyebrows shot up to heaven, the only part of him ever likely to get there, and he started banging his drum and bellowing like one at a funeral, saying here was a sight, and gather round and gather round. Soon I could hardly breathe for the heat coming off the bodies, and the elephant itself had to be revived with a bucket of cold water. "Let me lead you to the chair," said the knock-kneed knave, the bells on his hat winking and tinkling. I am gracious by nature, and I allowed myself to be led. "I will have to search you," said the creature, rolling his eyes at the crowd. "I must be sure that you are free of lead weights and any other advantages." "Touch me you won't," I cried. "I'll show you that there is," and I lifted up my dress over my head. I was wearing no underclothes in respect of the heat. There was a great swooning amongst the crowd, and I heard a voice compare me to a mountain range. However, it silenced my lord fool, who made no more remarks about a search, and simply showed me the chair. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air, and threw myself at the seat with all my might. There was a roar from round about me. I opened my eyes and looked toward Samson. He had vanished. His chair swung empty like a summer-house seat. His eyeglass lay in the bottom. I looked higher, following the gaze of the people. Far above us, far, far away, like a black star in a white sky, was Samson. It is a responsibility for a woman to have forced an elephant into the sky. What it says of my size I cannot tell, for an elephant looks big, but how am I to know what it weighs? A balloon looks big and weighs nothing. I know that people are afraid of me, either for the yapping of my dogs, or because I stand taller than any of them. When I was a child, my father swung me up onto his knees to tell me a story, and I broke both his legs. He never touched me again, except with the point of the whip he used for the dogs. But my mother, who lived only a while and was so light that she dared not go out in a wind, could swing me on her back and carry me for miles. There was talk of witchcraft, but what is stronger than love? When Jordan was new, I sat him on the palm of my hand the way I would a puppy, and I held him to my face and let him pick the fleas out of my scars. He was always happy. We were happy together, and if he noticed that I am bigger than most, he never mentioned it. He was proud of me because no other child had a mother who could hold a dozen oranges in her mouth at once. How hideous am I? One morning, soon after the start of the Civil War that should have been over in a month and lasted 8 years, Tradescant came to our house looking for Jordan. I was shouting at a neighbor of mine, a sunken block of a fellow with slant eyes and a nose to hang a hat on. This Cranesbill was telling me that the king was wrong to make war on his own people, and I was telling him that if the foul-mouthed Scots hadn't started their jiggery-pokery again, always wanting a fight with someone, we'd have had no war. We'd lived in a king, and without a parliament for 11 years, and now we'd got a parliament and precious little of a king. As far as I know it, and I have only a little learning, the king had been forced to call a parliament to grant him money for his war against the kilted beasts and their savage ways. Savage to the core, and the poor king trying only to make them use a proper prayer book. They wouldn't have his prayer book, and in a most unchristian manner threatened his throne. The king, turning to his own people, found himself with a parliament full of Puritans who wouldn't grant him money until he had granted them reform. Not content with the Church of England that good King Henry had bequeathed to us all, they wanted what they called a Church of God. They said that the king was a wanton spendthrift, that the bishops were corrupt, that our Book of Common Prayer was full of popish ways, that the Queen herself, being French, was bound to be full of popish ways. Oh, they hated everything that was grand and fine and full of life, and they went about in their flat gray suits with their flat gray faces poking out the top. The only thing fancy about them was their handkerchiefs, which they liked to be trimmed with lace and kept as white as they reckoned their souls to be. I've seen Puritans going past a theatre where all was merriment and pleasure and holding their starched linen to their noses for fear they might smell pleasure and be infected by it. It didn't take them long to close down every theatre in London once they got a bit of power. But didn't our Savior turn the water into wine? Our own minister of God soon turned Puritan and started denouncing the king from his pulpit. "Preacher Scroggs," I said, one morning after he had delivered his sermon on the text, "and the memory of the wicked shall rot. Do you not know that our king is so by divine right?" He fixed me with the better of his two squint eyes and clasped his hands together. "Look to the heavenly king, lady," he said. "There is no earthly power but Satan." I heard from his wife that he makes love to her through a hole in the sheet. "Does he not kiss you?" I said. "He has never kissed me," she answered, "for fear of lust." Then lust must be a powerful thing, if to kiss her that most resembles a hare, with great ears and staring eyes, brings it on. It is a true saying that what you fear you find. My neighbor, who has a fondness for Preacher Scroggs, largely since like finds like, was addressing me in the most pompous terms about the will of God, as though he knew God as well as I do my dogs. Thus I was forced to shout him down, reason being wasted on a block, and thus did Tradescant find me. Madam, calm yourself," he said in his gentle way. I turned, and though I hadn't seen him for 2 years, I recognized him at once. "Mr. Tradescant," I said, "I'm defending the king." "A noble cause," said he. At this my neighbor claimed he'd never kneel before a king until he knelt before Jesus. Any time now, he said, the rule of saints would begin on earth, and all the sinners would be burned up and confounded. I had no choice but to strangle him, and though I used only one hand and held him from the ground at arm's length, he was purple in no time, and poor Tradescant was swinging on my arm like a little monkey, begging me to stop. "I'll spare him for your sake, sir," I said, and dropped the ugly thing into his own midden. I thought no more of him, but took Tradescant into our house for a pot of ale. He seemed pale, no doubt from his journey. "I've come about Jordan," he said. And it seems that he wanted a gardener's boy at Wimbledon, where he was laying out a great garden for Queen Henrietta. He refused to let the troubles interrupt his work. He had it in his mind that when the Queen returned from the Continent in triumph to the King, bringing the children who were hidden for safety, the garden would stand as a monument to her courage. But how could I lose Jordan, so dear to me and my only comfort? Tradescant tried all his gentle ways to persuade me. I continued to refuse, saying it was too far for my boy to travel daily. And yet I wanted Jordan to have the work, knowing how it would delight him to see such exotic things growing all in one place. At length I hit on a solution. "I'll accompany him," I said. Tradescant seemed surprised, so I continued. "I have a mind to take the air of Wimbledon for a time." "There's nowhere for you to live," he said. "Jordan will have to share with the other men of the estate." I have a flair for architecture, having built my own hut, and I assured Tradescant that I could build another. He spread his hands. He sighed, but I knew I had beaten him. "And my hounds, I must bring them." He asked me how many I had, and I comforted him that there were just a few at present. "When can I expect you?" "We will begin our journey tomorrow. In what direction is Wimbledon?" He said the coachman would be sure to know, and as he seemed in a hurry to leave, I did not press him, thinking I could find out from the innkeeper at the Crown of Thorns. It was 3 days later that a half-wit went foaming and stuttering to Mr. Tradescant, crying that the garden had been invaded by an evil spirit and her hounds of hell. Tradescant came running to the great gates, and he must have been relieved to see it was only myself holding Jordan by the hand. "Your dogs," he said, and I saw his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. "Yes," I replied, "no more than 30 and only 5 ready for breeding." He was a gentleman, and if he had seemed taken aback, he soon recovered himself and asked if he may pay for our carriage and perhaps send help to fetch our belongings. "There is no carriage," I told him, "and here are our belongings." I raised a bundle of red cloth like a great Christmas pudding. Jordan had his boat under his arm. "But how—" "We walked," I said, and when Jordan was tired I carried him. Tradescant said nothing, but tried to take my bundle, which immediately flattened him to the ground. Very tenderly, as a mother knows how, I scooped him up in my arms, the bundle on top of him, and with my 30 dogs and Jordan coming behind, we entered the gate of the great house and began our new life as servants of the king. I slept in my suspended bed for 2 fitful hours and then winched myself down to breakfast feeling seasick. My hosts that morning were engaged in archery practice, and I was able to excuse myself and comb the city for the dancer. No one in the house recalled her, though how that were possible with her loneliness that devoured the rest of the company in tongues of flame, I do not know. I began first at the theatre, and then went on to the opera, and then with increasing dread in ever-decreasing circles of infamy, cafes and casinos and bawdy houses, and at last to a pen of prostitutes kept by a rich man for his friends. The women were gracious, but urged me to return in female disguise. That way I might be granted admittance. As a man, however chaste, I would be driven away or made a eunuch. I did as they advised and came to them in a simple costume hired for the day. They praised my outfit and made me blush by stroking my cheek and commenting on its smoothness. We drank unfortified wine, and when the custodian passed and asked who it was they were entertaining, one stood up and said I was her cousin from afar. They knew nothing of the dancer. She was not of their company, though they promised to inquire among friends. How could they bear such privation? Their quarters were very comfortable, with every kind of couch and bed and game to play, but they were not allowed to go outside. How could they live without space? There was silence, and it seemed as though they were communicating without words. Then one spoke to me and explained that they were not so confined as it seemed, that through the night they came and went as they pleased. How could this be? The house was barred. Each door had 13 locks. The windows were too high to reach, and the skylights, though always kept open, could not be broached. Underneath the house was a stream. The stream, on its way to the river, on its way to the sea, passed beneath the lodgings of quite a different set of women, nuns. This convent, the convent of the Holy Mother, had its cellars opening over the stream. Every night, any of the women who wished to amuse herself in the city, visit friends, eat dinner with her beloved, dropped herself into the fast-flowing water and was carried downstream towards the convent. It was the custom of the nuns to keep watch over the stream through the night, and any of the women shooting past the convent vault was immediately fished out in a great shrimping net by the nun on duty. Some of the women had lovers in the convent. Others, keeping a change of clothes there, went their way in the outside world. At dawn the women were let down into the water, and with great fortitude swam upstream into their locked citadel. Their owner, being a short-sighted man of scant intelligence, never noticed that the women under his care were always different. There was an unspoken agreement in the city that any woman who wanted to amass a fortune quickly would go and work in the house, and rob the clients, and steal the ornaments supposedly safe on the wall. He did not know it, but this selfish man, to whom life was just another commodity, had financed the futures of thousands of women who were now across the world or trading in shops or as merchants. He had also, single-handed, paid for the convent's renowned stock of fine wine and any number of altarpieces. Some years later, I heard that he had come into his pleasure chamber one day and found it absolutely empty of women and of treasures. He never fathomed the matter, and made no connection between that event and the sudden increase in novitiates at the convent of the Holy Mother. I have met a number of people who, anxious to be free of the burdens of their gender, have dressed themselves men as women and women as men. After my experience in the pen of prostitutes, I decided to continue as a woman for a time and took a job on a fish stall. I noticed that women have a private language, a language not dependent on the constructions of men, but structured by signs and expressions, and that uses ordinary words as code words meaning something other. In my petticoats, I was a traveler in a foreign country. I did not speak the language. I was regarded with suspicion. I watched women flirting with men, pleasing men, doing business with men, and then I watched them collapsing into laughter, sharing the joke, while the men, all unknowing, felt themselves master of the situation and went off to brag in bathrooms and to preach from pulpits the folly of the weaker sex. This conspiracy of women shocked me. I like women. I am shy of them, but I regard them highly. I never guessed how much they hate us or how deeply they pity us. They think we are children with too much pocket money. The woman who owned the fish stall warned me never to try and cheat another woman, but always to try and charge the men double, or send them away with a bad catch. Their noses are dull, she said. They won't be able to mark a day-old lobster from a fresh one. And she asked me to remember that a woman, if cheated, will never forget and will someday pay you back, even if it takes years, while a man will rave and roar and slap you perhaps, and then be distracted by some other thing. Thinking to teach me about men, worrying that I knew nothing, she wrote me a rulebook of which I will list the first page. 1. Men are easy to please, but are not pleased for long before some new novelty must delight them. 2. Men are easy to make passionate, but are unable to sustain it. 3. Men are always seeking soft women, but find their lives in ruins without strong women. 4. Men must be occupied at all times, otherwise they make mischief. 5. Men deem themselves weighty and women light, therefore it is simple to tie a stone round their necks and drown them should they become too troublesome. 6. Men are best left in groups by themselves, where they will entirely wear themselves out in drunkenness and competition. While this is taking place, a woman may carry on with her own life unhindered. 7. Men are never to be trusted with what is closest to your heart, and if it is they who are closest to your heart, do not tell them. 8. If a man asks you for money, do not give it to him. 9. If you ask a man for money and he does not give it to you, sell his richest possession and leave at once. 10. Your greatest strength is that every man believes he knows the sum and possibility of every woman. I was much upset when I read this first page, but observing my own heart and the behavior of those around me, I conceded it to be true. Then my heaviness was at its limit, and I could not raise myself up from where I was sitting. But I did look around me, and I saw that I was one in a long line of unfortunates sitting like crows on a fallen tree. All were wailing piteously, and none could move on account of their sorrows. I was lucky that my hands were free, and reaching down into my fish basket, I took out a red mullet and waved it over my head. Soon a flock of seabirds appeared screeching at the sight of the fish. I waved another in my left hand, and as I had hoped, the birds dived to catch the fish. When they fastened their beaks onto my bait, I did not let go, and the birds, maddened at any resistance to their feeding, flapped all the harder and succeeded in pulling me up with them. I let go at once, but the birds, somehow imagining me as a great fish, carried me up into the air and flew me over the city and out to sea. Far below, I watched the waves crashing against high cliffs and saw the sails of ships passing to the tropics. I fainted from fear, and when I revived, I was no longer in the air, but seemed to be on the window-sill of a well-appointed house in a town I did not recognize. A young girl came to the window, and asking me if I were the sister she had prayed for, courteously invited me to bed with her, where I passed the night in some confusion. That's the end of this section. I hope you guys like it. What do you think of this book so far? I want to hear everything you have to say. If there's any confusion, I'm honestly a little confused too, but I feel like the more we read together and discuss together, the more we're going to understand. But for me, so far, I'm really loving the imagery, and I like that things don't really make sense, like that house where there were no floors. I mean, that seems pretty impossible. And there were crocodiles in the bottom, and glasses would fall and they would eat them. Oh my goodness. So yes, please let me know everything you're thinking about this section so far, what you think about the book so far. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing all of your comments. Take care.